Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm Karel van Rooij. I'm together with Eblin the community of practice leader for teamwork group coaching. Thanks a lot for a huge participation rate. Again, we had more than 600 registrants, which is an absolute record. Thank you for your loyalty. Thank you also the new members. Like always, I go through some introductory slides. I hope that the system, yes, voila. So as usual for the rest of this year, the first Tuesday of each month, you can block your agenda for our webinar. As from next year, we will only have 4 webinars of 90 minutes rather than of 1 hour. And you will get 1.5 CEU for them. So we go to 4 webinars in 1 year, and they will be a little bit longer. That's the new system of ICF. You can download this slide deck here at the, I think that ICF has printed them, yes, here with the handouts. Here you can download this very slide deck to have all the dates in front of you. So the topics are always focused on team and group coaching, on what is it, the role, the skills, the attitude, analysis, team interventions, conflict coaching, etc., etc., etc. If you ever would like to see another topic being treated then as already been treated, please feel free to send us a message that you want to become a speaker yourself. If you want to stay connected and be part of the community, this is the link you have to use if you want to receive the mailings to be invited for the webinars. If you want to share feedback, you can use this email address. We are also on LinkedIn. You can find the link here. We are on Facebook. You can find the link here. And we're also on Twitter. Thanks to Eblin, the new co-leader since half a year. We're also on Twitter. And if you missed the webinar, you can find back the recordings on our YouTube channel and on our SlideShare channel. Once again, you find all these links on the slide deck you can download. New is that you do not need any longer to send us passwords. The one that participate by phone and even the one that have some technical difficulties during the webinar, it is enough to simply send a request for a credential to Lauren Maggie. There's no need to send passwords anymore, so I'm not going to give you passwords anymore, of course. Please allow us 1 week to manage everything, and if in 1 week you still haven't received anything, please send a reminder again to Lauren Maggie. So that's for the introduction. Now let me introduce our fantastic speaker. Well, I had a picture ready, but here is the guy himself. So, yep. Hi, Scott. I had a picture. You can compare the picture with the real thing as you wish.
Yeah, that's gonna like give away the secret.
Scott Eblin, welcome, Scott. Thanks, because it's already the second time that you are willing to share your experience and your thoughts on team coaching with us. You are the founder of the Eblin Group, which is a large consulting and coaching group active in the Fortune 5 dimension of executives. You've been an executive yourself in those industries. You've written 2 books, The Next Level, What Insiders Know About Executive Success, and also the last one, Overworked and Overwhelmed, which is given a prize of Best Business Book of 2014 by the Globe and Mail. Wow. What touches me in your bio, Scott, is that you talk about the school of real life. What a great metaphor for your work. And what also touches me is that you talk about purposeful leadership to simplify complex situations, and also the link between how to measure on results, how to measure significant improvements on the one hand, and then in mindful leadership on the other. That is not so evident to link mindful leadership and measurable results. You've studied at the Harvard University and on all kind of other very important business schools that I hear from Europe honestly don't know all by heart. But it is a huge honor for me, Scott, to give you the floor, and lots of success.
Thank you so much, Carl. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to wait on the ability to broadcast my slides. There we go. And let's get these pulled up. and see how this all works. Okay. Well, good day, wherever you are in the world. We've got around 300 or so people with us today, so I'm assuming we're covering lots of different time zones. As for me, I'm in Santa Monica, California. This morning it's about a little bit after 8 a.m. Pacific time in Santa Monica. So this is the first thing I'm doing today, so hopefully it goes okay and we can all have some interesting conversations together. The topic that I'm going to talk about today and share with you is Carl just mentioned School of Real Life. This is a School of Real Life case study, really, on coaching cross-functional leaders to rely on each other. And for those of you that joined me in the webinar that I did, I think last year on the book Overworked and Overwhelmed, we really kind of ripped through that webinar in a hurry because there was a lot of material to cover. Today's pace is going to be a little bit more relaxed. And so I really encourage you to use the chat function on the system here to submit your questions. Carl's going to be monitoring that for us as we go along, and he'll interrupt me from time to time. I'll also ask for questions from time to time. But what I'm going to do today is share with you this case study of an actual client situation that I worked in earlier this year. Had a great partnership with the representatives, the learning and development representatives from the company that we worked in. I'm not going to name the company today, probably for obvious reasons, just to protect the confidentiality issues. But just to set a little bit of context, let me go ahead and do that. This was a global manufacturing company. They are operating in probably 100+ countries around the world, and each of those countries has a general manager. And so that general manager is basically the country's, one way to think about it is they're that company's ambassador to the country, not in an official sense of being an ambassador, but they kind of practically speaking play that role. They have a lot of interaction with customer groups, with government groups, with industry groups and competitors, and they're just very publicly facing people for their company in those countries, and they have a lot of authority, okay? And so they also work with, let's see if we can get this working here, they work with very closely a technical lead in that same country. Sometimes the technical lead will cover more than one country, maybe 2 or 3, but this is a highly technical company, and that technical lead is sort of like the subject matter expert in chief. And so they become, the technical lead, a key member of each GM's cross-functional management team, which would include marketing and finance and production and operations and a lot of different roles, right? But one of those main roles is sort of like chief scientist, if you will, or the chief technical person. So those are the two parties that have had issues with each other. Over the years, there's been a lot of emphasis in this company on who has the decision rights, right? And who gets to make the final call when a decision has to be made. And that emphasis on decision rights has generated both some quantitative and qualitative evidence that the technical leads have felt somewhat disempowered in the decision-making process, that they maybe don't feel as heard as they would like to be, where the decision-making process is perhaps not as collaborative as they would like it to be. The GMs, for the most part, and we'll see this a little bit later, the GMs, for the most part, think things are going pretty well, right? Because they're the GM and they get to make the decision quite often. Probably in 80 or 85% of the scenarios, they would be the final decision maker. But the technical lead people are feeling like they're not full participants in that process. And so the workshop that we put together was part of a longer conversation that the company had already started with their GMs and their technical leads around the world. And my job was to help come in at the end of a 2-day conversation where there was a lot of technical information shared, frankly, far beyond my pay grade. Nothing, a lot of stuff that I frankly didn't understand as a coach, right? I mean, it's just, I'm not trained in their subject matter domain. But my job, paying attention to the dynamics in the room, was to come in for the last half day, the last afternoon of that session, and focus on the how. How do you work together, and how have you been working together, and what would make that work better in the future in terms of the how. In other words, we just spent a day and a half talking about the what of what you do together, and like a lot of in-depth conversation on content and regulatory policy and this and that and the other. But how do you work together, and how do you make decisions together for the good of the country that you're operating in, your presence in that country, as well as the company overall and everybody on your teams. And so basically what I did was a workshop, and what I'll share with you today is the workshop format. I don't have any handouts today for a couple of reasons. One is I consider this slide deck to be somewhat confidential. I don't really want it widely distributed because it is, relates to a particular company, even though we're keeping them confidential. And the other thing with the slide deck is a lot of the resources I'm going to share today, pretty much all the resources I'm going to share, are very easily and widely available to you. There's very little in this workshop that I dreamed up on my own. I worked, like I said, in a really nice partnership with the representatives from the learning and development team from the company. But what we did basically was try to figure out what are we trying to accomplish in the workshop, and how do we do that, and what resources are available to us to facilitate a conversation that leads to hopefully, more positive, long-lasting outcomes between these two players, the GMs and the technical leads in each country. So the workshop involved a review of some internal survey results, which I'll share a few highlights of that from you, or with you. And it's data from the company. Again, the company is disguised, so you can't really tell which company or even industry it's in. But you'll get a sense of what the dynamic is, or has been historically, between the GMs and the technical leads. And so that was a pretty important element of the workshop, and I'll say more about that momentarily. And then we focused on personal communication styles. We used a resource, a self-assessment, which we sent out in advance of the two-day meeting. We asked everybody to complete that for themselves, and then we pulled all the results together in the aggregate. And that's a self-assessment called What's My Communication Style from HRDQ Publishers. And it's widely available, easy to get online. And I think there may be a small licensing process or a small licensing fee for that. It's really nominal, and really very little training required to administer that assessment and to debrief people on it. And I'll talk today about how we did that. And then we moved from personal communication styles to team decision-making modes. And really the framework that we used as a reference point on that comes from the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, abbreviated here TKI, the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument. That's published by Consulting Psychologist Press, based in the United States, but available worldwide on the web. And so the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument was a reference point kind of framework that we used, and I'll say more about how we used that. And then finally, we asked the participants, almost finally, next to last step, we asked the participants to go apply some of these insights from the first part of the workshop to a very long, like a half an hour long, one-on-one breakout conversation between the GM and the technical lead. And so we asked them, I'll share with you the questions we asked them to consider during that breakout session. And then finally, I'll share a little bit of what we heard back in the debrief and what's been observed in the months since the workshop. And so again, my goal today is really just to share with you how we work. This was a group of about 100 people, 70, 80, somewhere between 75 and 100 people. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a pretty large room. And so we were trying to bring, a conflict management solution to a relatively large group of people at one time and walk them through this. I wouldn't call it pure coaching by any means, because there really wasn't a lot of coaching from me to them going on, other than maybe a few anecdotal conversations during the workshop itself. But I think what we did do was set them up for a lot of peer coaching and a lot of self-discovery kind of coaching, as part of the workshop, and hopefully setting them up to continue with that after the workshop. And Carl, again, feel free to interrupt me at any time as you develop questions on the chat board. Folks, if you have questions about anything that I'm saying, please write a little note to the chat board, and Carl will be monitoring that. And as we get some critical mass on different questions,
there are already a few questions coming in. Not so many yet, but 2 or 3. Did participants actually complete the comp style assessment prior to the workshop? What does HRDQ mean, please? And how many facilitators did you have with that size group?
Yeah, okay, great. So we had HRDQ means, I'm not sure what it means actually. It's the name of the company. I'll just hold up here's like my printout. I don't know if you can see it, Carl. I've put my website away. But here's my printout of the report. It says, what's my communication style? HRDQ down here at the bottom, HRDQ style series. They are in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And so if you Google HRDQ, look for Westchester, Pennsylvania, you will find them. And it's the What's My Communication Style online self-assessment. And yeah, we had everybody complete that 2 or 3 weeks before the workshop began, and that allowed us some time to collate, all the results and roll up some, aggregate results for the group, which in the end, honestly, we didn't really need, and I'll explain why we didn't need that. We debriefed it in a very fun, physical kind of way. To the question on how many facilitators for the workshop, you're looking at them. It was just me. Again, I had some really terrific support from the folks in the company, and they stepped in a couple of times just as we were kind of moving people around the room into different groups for an in-the-room breakout. But, in terms of just engaging with the group and keeping the discussion moving, it was primarily me.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So everything I'm going to share with you now, pretty much from this point on, is the actual slides that we used in the workshop. And so we started out by talking about, with the participants, what intentions do we have for this half day? Because again, we've spent a day and a half talking about the what of your joint agenda, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that you guys work on together, that you folks work on together. It's an Americanism to say you guys when you mean both women and men. That's not a good thing, but it's a habit, unfortunately. So the what of your joint agenda, what we're going to focus on this afternoon and this last half day is the how of how you work together to accomplish it. So we've got the what on one hand and the how on the other. We really want to connect you around both of those. We want to build on what's already working. It's not like everything is broken. There's a lot of things that are working well in your working relationship and in the results that you're getting. So we want to build on that to make things even better. And, for all of us who are coaches, I think we get that concept. We want to help you understand the connection between your individual styles and also the options that are available to you as a team, as a duo, or sometimes a trio of GMs and technical leads working together. And then finally, we want to help you apply any insights that you develop today to a currently important issue. And so this gets back to the school of real life phrase that Carl brought up in introducing me. We asked them to identify a real live issue that they're working together and apply any insights they developed about individual styles or what the root causes of the conflict might be, or the team conversation modes that they've been in, and apply any or all of that to actually moving forward with a real issue and trying to get a better handle on that. We heard a little bit about their progress in the debrief at the end of the afternoon. So I've said several times, we want them to focus on the what and the how of what they're doing. And ideally, like any XY graph, the best place to be is in the upper right-hand corner. We want really high execution on the what of the agenda, and ideally really effective execution on the how of the agenda. And so that would kind of put us in the upper right-hand corner in terms of performance on this graph. And so I mentioned this company has put a lot of emphasis on decision-making roles and decision-making authority over the last several years, because they'd had some ambiguity around that in previous years. And so the model they used came from a Harvard Business Review article. At least I've seen it in a Harvard Business Review article, and there may be other places where this is sourced from. Unfortunately, I can't even tell you the HBR article right now. I should have gone back and looked that up. But if you just Google this model in Harvard Business Review, you'll probably find the source documents. So it's called DAI, and so the D is the decision maker, and the big question is, who's got the D? Who's got the decision? After all of the conversation, who has the authority to make the decision? And that's something that this company has invested a lot of time and effort into in any given scenario, any likely scenario, to determine who's got the D, who's got the decision. However, there's an A, right? And the A is the group of people who are advice givers to the ultimate decision maker. So quite often in this GM technical lead dynamic, the GM most of the time really is the decision maker. From all the research and work that they've done over the years, they will, when this happens, then this person makes a decision. When that happens, this other person makes the decision, or the same person makes the decision. We went through probably 30 different scenarios of who's got the D, not in the workshop, but earlier in the two-day meeting, with some electronic clickers. Here's a scenario. You've got a little electronic clicker that you can push a button on. Who's got it? A is the GM, B is the technical lead, C is somebody else. And for the most part, everybody understood who had the D in each of those scenarios, and almost all the time it was the GM that had the D. But the technical lead is there to give advice, right? And so the question really becomes, is their advice being heard, or is their advice being fully solicited? And that's an interesting question to consider, right? And we'll say more about that in a moment. And then finally, there are informed stakeholders, and they're not advice givers, but they're people that need to be informed of the decision because they have a stake in it, right? So those folks weren't really in the mix in this workshop, because we're primarily dealing with people who have the D and people who are primarily giving the A, the advice, right? So the DAI model is, some important context for understanding what's what. So I said the first thing we did basically was share with them some survey results. And I'm going to share with you a few questions that were highlights from a longer survey that the company put together. And they ran this a couple of months in advance of the two-day offsite. And again, this was people from around the world at this two-day offsite. What I've done is just to give you a sense of some of the main issues. I've boiled down some of the key questions from that survey. And so the first, and my job in this context, it was a little easier, maybe a lot easier for me as an outsider to walk through these survey results in some depth and to help people, basically call out, what are the implications of this? It's easier for me to do that as an outsider than it is for my partners from the learning and development group inside the company to do that. They had done a quick kind of a flyby on this survey at the beginning of the two-day workshop, but didn't really ask for a lot of comment and didn't really spend a lot of time on it. My job basically was to spend a lot of time on it, and it was easier for me to do that because I didn't really have a personal stake in it other than just being, their outside partner. So, for instance, this is a 5-point scale kind of question. Anything above a 4 gets a green rating. Anything in the 3 range gets a yellow rating. Anything below a 3 gets a red rating. And so that's just the color scheme here. My partner understands the priorities of my role. The GM, you can see, they feel like the technical leads understand what GM does. The technical leads, however, don't really feel that the GMs understand what they do, or at least they're kind of like lukewarm on that, right? You know, it's kind of like in the middle, so it's something that could benefit from some more attention. Now this one was actually pretty good. They, at a fairly high level, each agree that they seek feedback from each other when prioritizing deliverables. Okay, so that's some good news, right? However, you know, they say, I seek feedback from my partner. However, you know, when you get to the third item, my partner doesn't seek feedback from me so much, right? You know, the GMs are lukewarm on that, and it's kind of in the red zone for the technical leads. So there's a big gap, right? There's a big gap. I'm just going to draw on this for a little bit. There's a big gap between what the technical leads think they're doing and what they're receiving. There's a big gap between how the GMs think they're doing and how the technical leads actually think they're doing. You know, so it's there's some opportunities there, and we clearly pointed those out to the group, and they were a little bit surprised by that, and maybe a little uncomfortable to see it presented that way. But you know, you can't.
Yes, there is again some input coming in, with those three roles having to work together, and apparently confronted by these results. What's the role of influence, trusts, and eventual well, power and hidden agendas in all these relationships?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're going to get to, and the key word I think in this trust, right? And how do you establish more trust? And so when we get to the individual communications preferences and styles, and we get to the team modes, conversation modes that they may or may not be in, we really were trying to do that to establish some more trust. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a slide or two. Any other questions right now, Carl?
No, not.
Okay. Great question, though. So let me just reactivate this if I can. I'm going to have to pop out of this for a second. There we go. Okay, well, I got two instead of one. But then you can see the next two. You know, my partner has enough knowledge of the country business needs to make cross-functional decisions. Both the roles are kind of lukewarm on that one. My partner is clear on his or her Ds. I mean, like, you know, the other party, are they clear on their Ds? Again, kind of lukewarm on that. And finally, my partner approaches me in a respectful manner. Pretty big gap on that. That's all, you know, that's pushing towards a 100 basis point gap on that one. And, you know, really then you get down to the question of what does respectful look like? And it probably looks a lot like seeking feedback, you know, which we saw earlier where I drew the lines. So that's kind of those were the big headlines that came out of the survey highlights. We had 3 slides worth of survey highlights, but those are the ones that I think really kind of put a focus on what the opportunities were for the group.
So again, some interesting input, Scott. First of all, I apologize because in the office where I'm sitting right now, they're working very close to my office, so that's why probably some noise is being heard, but I can't put it off. There are questions regarding how this overview can be compared to the standard RACI matrix, the responsibilities, accountabilities, etc., which is commonly known in project management environments. And there's also a question on, there seems to be quite some focus on the GM and tech lead. How do you bring the other functions into equation with those two? So the RACI and the equation.
Right. So the first question, I'm not really familiar with the framework that's referred to, so I guess my thought would be if you see a connection between the survey questions and that framework, there probably is, but I can't really speak to that directly. And then in terms of bringing other parties in, the experience in the company, both qualitatively and quantitatively, up to this point had been that the big opportunity for better working relationships was between these two functions, you know, the GMs and the technical leads. And so that's, we really kind of put a laser beam on that in this workshop. I think some of the takeaways that they got from their breakout conversation have broader implications. And when I get to the end of the deck, I'll say a little bit about how the work that they did together during this workshop probably extends to people in other roles as well. There's one key takeaway from the breakout sessions, I think, in particular, that addresses that. So we were working on the what and the how. Whoops, I want to go backwards here. Working on the what and the how, right? And so this afternoon was primarily about the how. So one of the big components of how is, how do you like to be communicated with? That's not good grammar, but you know what I mean. You know, what are your preferences around the way people engage with you and communicate with you? And so this picture is the summary, basically, of this what's my communication style report. This is in some ways similar to the Myers-Briggs. It's not nearly as in-depth as the Myers-Briggs, and I think in the context of the workshop we were doing, that was a really good thing, because I'm a whatever the word is, certified Myers-Briggs person, as I'm sure many of you are. I think it's a great tool, but I don't think it's a tool that you can use quickly, usually, because it usually requires a lot of explanation. This tool didn't require a lot of explanation. So before the workshop kicked off, everybody had received a PDF of their own report, and we'd asked them to read that and get familiar with their own results. And so in reading through that result, they learned that they were sorted into at least one and possibly two, depending on the scoring. Some people as many as three, but not very many. One of these four categories: direct communicator, spirited communicator, considerate communicator, or systematic communicator. And you can see that the model is, if you ask questions that are work against these two scales: expressiveness from low to high, which, if you want to kind of compare that to Myers-Briggs, it might be extroversion and introversion, but expressiveness, low to high, and then assertiveness from low to high. How assertive are you? And so you can see if you're highly assertive and not very expressive, or lower on expressive, you'd be direct. If you're high assertive and high expressive, you're spirited, and so forth. And so it's basically a 2x2 matrix, and you get one of these four styles in each corner of the matrix. For a little bit more explanation of this, and this language is straight out of the HRDQ reporting. The instrument measures you on a number of different factors: verbal, paraverbal, body language, and one more that we decided not to include in this chart, just because we felt like this was enough information for now, and everybody had their own report anyway. And so, the characteristics of a verbal characteristics of a direct communicator: you're decisive, you're direct, you're kind of quick, you don't stop to say hello, and so forth. Spirited, you can see the characteristics here. Paraverbal is more about body, or it's the kind of the metaverbal. It's like the sound of the verbal communication, and then we have body language, and you can see that, right? Considerate listens on the verbal, speaks slowly on the paraverbal, likes the hug, likes the handshake on the considerate, and then systematic, more precise, even in the paraverbal, going to keep it brief on the paraverbal. Not a lot of facial expression, perhaps, with systematic people, and so forth, right? And so these are broad strokes, right? Like any report like this, you're going to get kind of broad. Yeah, please.
There is again some input. The participants are trying to imagine a meaningful comparison between what you are showing now and MBTI, DISC, and you can also add the Insights Discovery to that. What in your opinion is the most of these three is the most related to what you are explaining is now?
Of those three, which is the most related?
Well, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question. We chose this instrument mainly for simplicity's sake, It was super simple to administer, and it's super simple to report out. And we really just wanted to give people a reference point for where they were, and more importantly, where their partner might be, right? And so we did this in kind of a fun way, and this was my partner's, my company's partner's great idea. She'd used this instrument a lot. It's my first time using it, and she thought this would be a great way to get people to kind of unpack this. And so what we did, again, we had about 100 people in the room, and of course, as soon as we start putting this kind of information on the screen about the different styles, and everybody knows their own styles, the first question some people start asking is, well, what percentage of the technical leads are systematic, or what percentage of the GMs are direct, or whatever? And we just smiled and said, well, would you like to know? And said, oh yeah, we'd like to know. And well, here's how we did it. We had a flip chart in each corner of the room, a flip chart labeled direct, a flip chart labeled spirited, a flip chart labeled considerate, and a flip chart labeled systematic. And I'm sure you've probably done similar things with other instruments. And we said, okay, go walk to the flip chart that is your primary style. Okay, and so we had roughly equal clusters actually of people at each of the 4 charts. And then what we asked them to do in the group was help your, and the other thing we did was if you go back to this graph, we set it up so like you can see that direct and considerate are kind of opposite, and spirited and systematic are kind of opposite. We set the room up that way, right? And so the point being that if you're a direct communicator who's partnered with a considerate communicator, you're almost the opposite of each other, right? If you're a direct communicator who's partnered with a systematic communicator, there's actually some similarities there. But what we asked each flip chart group to do was write down on the flip chart and have a conversation with each other. Here are our top 10 tips for how you should communicate with us, how the rest of you should communicate with all of us direct people, or how the rest of you should communicate with all of us spirited people. And before we had them do that, we had them look around the room and identify which corner of the room their partner was standing at, right? Whether it was their GM or their tech lead, as the case may be. So they say, oh, okay, I've got my tech lead is spirited and I'm considerate or whatever, right? So we say, okay, so now I'm going to really pay attention on the debrief. And we had one person from each group speak on behalf of the group. Here's how you communicate with us. And they got a lot of questions back from the rest of the room. And the great thing about it was the physicality of it made it fun. The surprise factor of it made it fun. And the fact that you've got kind of an objective assessment that doesn't have anything to do with this company, but does, offer some insights into the people that you're working with from this company was a really valuable thing. And it put it back to the issue of trust. My experience, I'm sure a lot of you have the same experience, whenever you can offer an objective instrument like this that level sets people, like, oh yeah, we're all just people, we all have our preferences, and there's not some big hidden agenda with that preference. It's just like kind of my natural state, okay? And I can choose to be different than that natural state, but if I'm just going to go to default mode, this is me in default mode. And so this was a key kind of setup for the breakout session, right? And I think it probably ended up being the most important setup for the breakout session because the language of this was so easy: direct, spirited, considerate, systematic, and the report outs. Here's my top 10 tips, or our top 10 tips for dealing with us considerate people. The language and the report outs were so simple and so easy for people to grasp in the moment that it really became a useful tool for them in the breakout sessions. And I think it broke down a lot of barriers for people. They had made up stories about each other prior to coming there, about the reasons they did what they did. And this started to break down the stories a little bit. So that was thing one that we did. And then we wanted to get into how do you work together? What's your history been in the way you work together as a pair, as a two-person team? What have you been working on? How have you been working on it? One way to think about that from a different kind of labeling standpoint is what are the results that you're trying to get? and what's the strength of your relationship in terms of driving towards those results and helping you achieve those results. And for those of you that are familiar with the Thomas Kilmann instrument, it turns on an XY graph similar to this one. Their labeling is a little bit different. It's assertiveness, I believe it is, versus cooperativeness, which I find, I love the Thomas Kilmann as an instrument. I find those words a little bit cumbersome, especially cooperativeness, because people don't use that word in conversation very often. And whenever I use the Thomas Kilmann, just kind of like drawing it on a flip chart and talking about what it can teach us, I usually reframe it as results and relationships. What's your propensity to drive results from low to high, and what's your propensity to build relationships from low to high? And again, quite often, most of the value is in the upper right-hand corner. And so we began walking people through the different, excuse me, I'm losing my voice here a little bit. We spent a little bit of time briefing people on how to think about this model. There are 5 basic styles of how you can interact with a partner based on that framework. You can avoid the issue or avoid engagement. That's low on results and low on relationships. It's kind of a lose-lose proposition because we're not really engaging. You can compete on that relationship. Let me see if I've got this queued up. You can compete on that, or you can compromise on that, where I give a little bit, you give a little bit. We're both kind of in the middle on results and relationships. So a win-win, maybe with lowercase w's. You can take a competing style, which I'm all about getting my results, and I don't really care as much about the relationship. That's a win-lose proposition. Or you can accommodate, like I will give on this issue, maybe in the hopes that I get reciprocity and you give to me later, but I'll give for now and accommodate you and let go of my expectation around the results. In this case, I lose, you win. And then finally, if we're both all in on results, we're both all in on relationships, that's a collaborative style. It's, kind of capital W, win-win. And you can see the circles are different sizes, and what those circles represent is how much value is created in each of these styles. Excuse me, I'm really froggy. So like on avoiding, we're not really creating additional value. On competing, compromising, and accommodating, the value is more or less the same. We're not making the pie bigger. We're just how do we split the pie, really, is what it comes down to. And then finally, on collaborating, if we are willing to invest that much time and effort into it, we make the pie bigger. That's not to say that we should always go to collaborating, because not everything is worth investing all that time and effort, and we don't have the bandwidth on our calendar and our time and attention to go all in on everything anyway. Sometimes it might make sense to avoid. That issue is just not that important. We'll table that and get back to it later, or maybe get back to it never. And so then we talked a little bit in more detail about characteristics of these styles, had a little bit of a conversation in the room about why would you choose to use the avoiding style, what does it look like in terms of decision-making and behaviors, what's the feeling of the conversation. It could be one end or the other, either cautious or easygoing in this case on avoiding. And then what are the warning signs of overuse? And so we talked about each of these styles with that kind of framework, right? So competing, again, why would you use it for advocacy when you feel really strongly? What does it look like? Well, decision-making is imposed, which in that DAI model has been kind of one of the issues, like I have the decision rights, I can therefore impose my decision. But, the warning signs are maybe you're ignoring your partner, right, which our survey results suggested that could be the case. Or, I'm not asking for my partner's input on the A, the advice in the DAI model. And we talked about accommodating, like when would you accommodate and why would you do that? Well, to build goodwill and, to establish some reciprocity, to make the team bind together. This gets back to the trust thing again. If I'm willing to give a little bit, that builds some trust. what does it look like in terms of the decision-making factors and what behaviors show up, and it looks actually a lot like avoiding in terms of the atmosphere, cautious or easygoing. And then what are the warning signs of overuse with accommodating? You feel like you're giving up too much maybe, or maybe decisions get made that aren't really good decisions because they should have been hashed out a little bit more.
I still have some interesting input coming in, Scott.
Sure.
How, if it was, how was the relation made clear between the report of a social style, probably an individual assessment report on the one hand, and your most preferred way of dealing with conflicts on the other hand? So how do you relate your conflict, your preference in conflict management with your social preferences briefly?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we, in so many words, we ask the duos to consider in their breakout sessions, right? So for instance, if you're a direct communicator, and you remember the characteristics of a direct communicator, it's quite likely that your natural team style would be more competing, right? Because it's just boom, boom, boom. And we talked a little bit about that in the room and gave some examples or if you're a considerate communicator, you may be more accommodating in your team style, based on the characteristics I just shared. If you're systematic, you might be a little bit more compromising, because you're looking at it from both sides, perhaps, if you're systematic, right? But we didn't really want to give people their own answers. I mean, there's too many people. First of all, there's too many people in the room and not enough time in a 2.5-hour workshop to sort all of that out. But what we wanted to do was give them enough information, reference points on individual and reference points on team style, that they could have their own self-observations about that in the breakout and talk with each other a little bit about why they've been doing what they've been doing and how efficacious, to use a big word, how effective has that been up until now, and what changes might we make to be more effective. And so I'm not going to spend a ton more time on these slides, but you can get the gist of it. Compromising, I just mentioned that in the context of a more systematic approach, achieving moderation and balance. The warning signs on compromising is the biggest thing is you might settle for less. Maybe you actually should go more for a collaborating style because it's worth it, and the long-term impact of going all in on the results and relationships are so big, and there's so much leverage there that it's worth it. And so, again, not everything should be collaborative at this level, but some things probably should be more so. And we're just trying to, again, raise their level of awareness around trying to put some language to what they've been doing and help them recognize themselves in both the individual styles as well as the team styles. Oh yeah, I've been doing a lot of competing, and I didn't mean to compete, but I have been. Or I've been doing a lot of accommodating when I should have stepped up and said, hey, you need to listen. I should have been more direct, right? Or that would have been useful. And so again, what are you trying to do, and how do you need to work together to do it? What results are you trying to drive? What relational options do you have for getting to those results? That's sort of the recap on what we've done, and then we sent them to the breakout assignments. And so we had a fairly robust agenda for them, and this, I think it was 30 to 40 minutes that we gave them for the breakout. One is when we had at the flip charts, we had each of those 4 styles saying, here's our top 10 tips for communicating with us. Now in the breakout, each of you personalize that. As a direct communicator, these are the top 3 for me, especially with you. If you could do these things for me, that would be really helpful, and vice versa. What can I, you tell me what I need to do to better connect and communicate with you. So we really wanted them to go back to that. And there was a lot of traction on those conversations in the breakouts when they reported back to us. They really got a lot out of that. The team conversation modes, what have we been using the most? And basically, has that been working for us, or is it working for us? And where could we mix in some other styles or some other modes that would help, right? And so what's I just said this bullet point, what's the impact of that conversation mode? And how does it relate to some of those survey scores that we saw, where there's some fairly big gaps in that opening survey, between what the GMs think and the technical leads think? How does that connect? And how does that, what dots are we connecting here as we think about all the things that we've been through together this afternoon, the survey results and the different styles on individual and team communication? So given, what we've learned, which of those 5 modes, compromising, avoiding, competing, accommodating, collaborating, which of those would be optimal most of the time, given the way each of us are showing up, the goals we have together? Just like, is there a shift we need to make, is really the question there. And then if we made that shift, what would we see more of and less of in terms of behaviors? And this kind of ties back again to, here's my top 3 for you to communicate with me as a direct or systematic person. Here's my top 3 for you to communicate with me as a considerate person, or whatever it is, right? So just try to unpack a little behaviors. And what we're really hoping for here was they would make some commitments to each other, about, oh yeah, I'm not going to interrupt you so much, or I'm going to ask you more often for your opinion or your advice, and make sure that I get your advice before I make the decision, or whatever it might be. So that, that would be moving from competing to compromising or collaborating, at least, right? And then finally, what's on our plate right now, that we could apply some of the things that we've surfaced in the way we work together. Let's just have a fresh cut at that and spend the last 10 minutes or whatever talking about this current issue, and see if we have any breakthroughs, based on what we've learned about working with each other. Let's take a fresh look at the issue and see if anything new comes up. And so, the themes that came back were the individual communication styles really helped with the connection, and that definitely built trust. I mean, one thing that we saw for sure, I said, they had fun doing it. There was a lot of laughter in the room at the end of the afternoon, and really in the middle of the afternoon as well, where really for the full day and a half before that, it had been a pretty serious group. And, again, we're all human, and we're just, we all like to have fun at some level, and we all like to laugh, and, the familiarity that came through in that communication style exercise leads to some humor, and it leads to some, humor quite often is recognizing what we do all the time and making a joke about it, right? And that's kind of where we ended up with that, and it was a real trust builder for the different parties. We heard that the conflict mode assessment did point out some sort of default or go-to moves that people were making, so they came back with a higher level of awareness of what they had been doing and why that maybe wasn't as helpful as it could have been. We had several teams, not all of them, but we had several teams report that they did resolve some open issues during the breakout. And the other thing that was really interesting was pretty much to a person in the room when we came back for the final debrief, they recognized that, who's got the D, even though the rule book almost, and it really is almost a rule book, says that the general manager has the D, that really the D should be pushed as far down in the organization as possible. So when somebody asked the question earlier, like, what about everybody else on the team besides the GM and the technical lead, this is where that comes in, right? Because the technical lead has a bunch of people working for them, the GM has a bunch of people working for them, and what the GM and the technical lead both agree is whatever our Ds are, we probably shouldn't be doing that ourselves all the time, really. We should try to push that as far down into the organization as possible and save our absolutely positively we have the D situations for when it can't be resolved lower than our level, right? And when it has to be resolved at our level, then we're going to talk with each other more before the D is finally made. It's more of an input-seeking approach to, getting to the decision. And
Scott,
finally,
there is still some input coming in. There are 5 more minutes left. Do you want to take questions or you want to proceed?
This is my last point, actually, so we're good for questions. You know, it's been several months since we've had the workshop. We've had a lot of video conference debriefs with different people from around the world since then about how they've been applying the things that came out of the workshop and came out of the meeting that week. And the early reports are good. It seems to be sticking, and it seemed like, you know, an intervention that, you know, kind of jump-started a better way of working together. And again, you know, this was a complete partnership between myself and the L&D people in the company. I love working with this particular company because it is such a strong partnership, and we really kind of co-create this stuff together. And so
two questions that I'm interpreting here. I can imagine that when you talk about social styles and conflict preferences, that things can become pretty confronting for some participants in terms of awareness. What of that work, what of the caring work, the caring for coachees, needed to be done individual? Or has it all been part of the group exercise? Has there been, what has been the need for any individual care towards coachees? That's one question. And the second one, in terms of sustainable changes in behavior, in behavioral preferences after that exercise, what have been your experiences there?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first. It's been 4 or 5 months since this episode or since this workshop. And as I said, based on the video conference check-ins and and just the reports from their managers, it seems to be better. You know, is it 100% better? I doubt it, but is it better? Yes. Is it, you know, maybe 100% better in some cases, but probably not all cases. In terms of the, you know, helping each individual feel safe with the you know, the potential confrontational aspect of this, I'll say what's not happening. There, you know, not 100 people in the room don't all have individual coaches, so that's not how it's been followed up on. The video conferences that I mentioned have been one way to follow through on it, just to keep the conversation going. Each of these people have managers that they report to, and most of those managers were in the room for the workshop, so they're familiar with, you know, the conversations that are held, and they're in a position to help support it, you know, through managerial coaching and mentoring. But we don't have, you know, there's not a formal, full-on coaching structure in place to support these people after the workshop. That's not the case.
Okay, Scott. Just for time management, within 1 minute, it's about time. What are your time constraints? Would you still have 5 or 10 minutes more, or are you having a strict schedule?
I can take 5 more minutes.
So the participants, those needing to leave because of other obligations, please feel free to leave us. Thank you for participating. And please join us for the next webinar, and the ones that are still available to stay for a few minutes, your questions are welcome. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Scott. Great session. There you go.
Do you have any other questions, Carl? Or
I'm reading here the list. Now lots of thank yous coming in. I'm reading a lot of thank yous, which is great. Participants, do you still have any further questions for Scott? Please, it's the moment now. Thank you. Excellent. Great webinar. There they go. I think that so far I'm not reading. Yes. Practically, how do you structure your billing project for a project like this?
That's a complicated question, because it's complicated, honestly, because this workshop was part of, gosh, months worth of work on a lot of other issues, so it kind of all got rolled in together. And, yeah.
Okay. Further, I don't see any more fundamental questions on the contents, rather on some practicality tools that we will deal with afterwards. Yes, that's a good one. Upon reflection, now that you've gone through the entire process, Scott, what would you change if next time you would have to do it again?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would love to have had a little more time. Two things probably. I would have loved to have had a little more time for the duos, the GMs and the technical leads to work together. Would have loved. I mean, somebody mentioned the coaching support. It would have been awesome to have, enough coaches there to support the small group conversations. But that's probably a pie in the sky wish, because we would have needed 20 to 40 coaches probably to do that. But I think given the time constraints, that we had, the size of the group that we had to work with, which was a pretty large group, we felt like it was a good design, and the feedback and the outcomes that we've observed, seem to confirm that. So, yeah, it's always nice to have more time, and it's always nice to have more coaching support. I'm not sure we could have had that in this case.
Yeah. Okay. So one last remark. The key questions regarding the PowerPoint presentation of Scott keep on coming in. For reasons of client confidentiality, Scott has chosen not to share his documents, which I fully and totally respect. However, as Scott said himself, there are no big secrets in terms of methodologies in this guide, in his slide deck. So basically, when you Google them, you will find pretty most the same things. And of course, you can always contact Scott individually if you have any further questions regarding that information. Further, I think that we are pretty much done with new questions. Yes, overall, Scott, the mailbox that I'm looking at here is full of feedback going from very good to excellent. And by this, I want to thank the participants that are still with us. Thank you so much to have stayed so long with us. Scott, I am grateful, truly grateful for so much commitment towards our community of practice. Not once, but 2 times you've enlightened us with your vision, with your experience, and with your insights. It was, in one word, phenomenally great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, IC. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, and have a great week coming up. Thank you, Carl, and thanks, ICF.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.